Hey guys, today I wanted to talk a little bit about the differences between Blood Stance and Sand Stance. I've recently started to play a Lacerate Gladiator build in Solo Self-Found Hardcore, and for the purpose of this video I'll mainly be comparing the two stances in the context of using Lacerate with the bleed mechanic. However, I do believe that the insight this discussion will provide will also be quite applicable to many other melee builds that take advantage of blood and sand or flesh and stone. So let's get straight to it. Blood and Sand is an aura that allows the player to reserve 10% of their mana pool and switch between Blood Stance and Sand Stance. In Blood Stance, they are able to deal more AoE damage but at the cost of decreased AoE size, whereas in Sand Stance they are able to increase the AoE size of their AoE skill but at the cost of decreased AoE damage. Compared to its counterpart Flesh and Stone, Blood and Sand happens to be quite simple in its effects and trade-offs for choosing one stance over the other. For Flesh and Blood, however, players are able to reserve another 25% of their mana pool in order to obtain different effects for the respective stance they are in. While Flesh and Blood is active, Blood Stance will maim nearby enemies, increasing the physical damage the enemies will take from the player's attacks. However, in Sand Stance, Flesh and Blood will blind nearby enemies, decreasing their chance to hit the player by 50%, as well as decrease the damage taken from sources not nearby to the player by about 10%. Just from looking at these effects, we can see that Blood Stance is essentially an offensive single target damage stance, while Sand Stance is the more defensive speed clear option. This is even more the case when using these auras in conjunction with Lacerate. When in Blood Stance, Lacerate actually deals more bleed damage, which really helps with the single target DPS and bossing, while with Sand Stance it gains an increased angle for its projectiles, which allows for better AoE and map clear. Now, the most important thing for players to consider is when should you use Blood Stance versus when should you use Sand Stance, and the simple answer is it depends on the player. However, I will go into depth on how I believe each stance should be used, and you guys can kind of take that viewpoint into consideration before deciding how and when you should use these stances yourselves. So generally speaking, the way I like to switch between the stances is quite simply Blood Stance for bossing and Sand Stance for everything else. And the reason for this is that oftentimes you will be one-shot from various mechanics that aren't easily seen when mapping, and so I generally feel more comfortable with Sand Stance up most of the time, especially in Solo Self-Found Hardcore. However, when it comes to boss fights, generally these fights have more to do with actually reading and dodging the boss mechanics in order to survive and less to do with improving your defensive RNG. That's basically my take on these stances and why you would normally see me with much greater uptime on Sand Stance as opposed to Blood Stance. Now, something interesting that I would like to bring to your attention is the option of using one of these auras but not the other, especially in the context of using Flesh and Stone without Blood and Sand. For my current Lacerate Gladiator, I am actually running Flesh and Stone and foregoing the choice of activating it in conjunction with Blood and Sand. When players have only Flesh and Stone active, they're actually still able to switch between Blood and Sand stance in order to reap the benefits of the aura. However, by dropping Blood and Sand, they don't really experience any downsides in terms of their AoE size or damage when using Flesh and Stone. As such, I found that running only Flesh and Stone without the use of Blood and Sand is very much my preferred way of using this stance changing mechanic, and it has vastly helped my progression through raid class in Solo Self-Found Hardcore. That's all I really wanted to talk about in this discussion about Blood Stance versus Sand Stance. Thank you guys for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.